Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we continue our preview of sorts of this upcoming season, and we take a look at individual awards. We mentioned ESPN's prediction of Eastern Conference standings. They've done the same for those individual honors. Are there any Bucks that have a chance to take home some of that hardware? We get into their thoughts and share ours coming up after this here on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We both thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. You can find us on YouTube, as some of you have joined us on the live stream of today's show, and of course, wherever you get your podcasts. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Camille, yesterday on the show, we discussed ESPN's predictions for standings in the Eastern Conference. I don't know if we ever actually shared where we slotted the Bucks to come in. I know I think I said, look, you could convince me it's going to be anywhere from 2 to 5. Mm-hmm. ESPN predicted the Bucks would finish 5th. We talked about the importance of Giannis and Dame and Chris Middleton and their health, but even more so the continued growth from everyone behind them and just the overall improved landscape in the Eastern Conference. So they did that, those predictions a couple of days ago. Then the next day, they did the Western Conference standings predictions. And then yesterday, it was individual awards that they shared their thoughts on. Look, the Bucks haven't really played a major role in this for years. When you had Giannis winning back-to-back MVP awards, Bobby Portis was in contention for Sixth Man of the Year. You had Bud win Coach of the Year and John Horst Executive of the Year. But all of that has kind of started to die down. Mm-hmm. And just taking a look at what this ESPN panel has put together, it seems like that tapering off is going to continue even more so this upcoming season.
It really does. And honestly, like, my question is, like, does that surprise you at all? Like, when you think about how ESPN has it laid out, for example, for MVP, according to ESPN, their prediction is for Giannis to come in at 5th in the MVP standings, with Luka winning his first one, Nikola Jokic at 2, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander at 3, Anthony Edwards at 4, then Giannis at 5, followed by Embiid, Tatum, Anthony Davis, Ja Morant, and Kevin Durant. And when I look at that, I think about what Giannis would need to do in order to win an MVP, another MVP, especially with having Dame as a teammate, right? So the dynamic changes a little bit there. It's like Giannis would have to have just an out of this world type of season, I think, to get him back into that consideration. I do think, as we mentioned, I think this past year with Giannis's MVP case, which was he's consistent. The game is very, very consistent, although he was the first player in NBA history to score at least 30 while shooting at least 60% from the field last year. If you look at how he got his points and his dominance, it's the same way. It's around the rim. It is that level of dominance there. And I think that while his game still remains the same, it's not going to give voters an initiative to try to vote for him, but rather they'll look for something new.
I would say this. I mean, let's just breeze through where I don't want to say no chance, but we don't really think there's going to be any Buck in consideration. Rookie of the Year, as much as we loved what we saw from A.J. Johnson during Summer League, he is not going to be in contention for the Rookie of the Year. Defensive Player of the Year, I want to come back to that a little bit later. Most Improved, again, probably not there unless we see a massive leap from Andre Jackson Jr., which we've already seen Josh point out in the comments that, hey, Andre Jackson Jr., don't sleep on him for Most Improved. But that one is probably another one that you can put aside for now with little to no Bucks involved in there. Coach of the Year is interesting because as we spent a lot of time talking about, first off season for Doc Rivers, first training camp with these young guys. And look, when we said they could finish anywhere from second to fifth, they finished second. And this looks like what we envisioned a year ago when you acquired Damian Lillard. Contrast that with how things were looking towards the end of the season and all the jokes everybody got in on Doc Rivers starting in March a year ago. That could be a very, very interesting one. I wouldn't necessarily shut the door on that. ESPN's choice was Tom Thibodeau of the Knicks to win Coach of the Year. Mark Daigneault second there, followed by Joe Mazzulla. Doc Rivers was not in the top 10 of this list. So what are your thoughts on Coach of the Year?
Doc has an uphill battle, I think, for that particular award. I mean, history does matter, and I think that does, I don't want to say cloud voters' judgment, but it affects it in a certain degree. And I think with Doc Rivers, again, the Bucks would have to win the East, like be number one in the East, I think, for Doc Rivers to even get consideration for that particular award. And that is something I don't necessarily see happening for the Bucks this upcoming season. But it's tough. The Coach of the Year, like, you have to be clear and above, like, best in your conference for the most part. You have to do something different, and I think
just
for the
completely
Bucks,
unexpected. Yeah, like,
right,
wow,
unexpected, and I don't
they
think
jumped
that there's
forward
a
a year. They skipped a
pathway.
year in the process.
Right, I don't think there's a pathway for the Bucks and Doc Rivers to accomplish that.
Yeah, that's one of the lower tier ones in terms of Bucks involvement, but I don't think you can totally shut the door on it. Still, if you pressed me, I don't think it's going to be like the Knicks would have to win the Eastern Conference for Tom Thibodeau. They were the 2 seed last year, and they were the talk of the town last year. So basically, if we're predicting the same thing from the Knicks this year with the addition of Mikal Bridges, I don't think that's enough to propel you to Coach of the Year. Mark Daigneault won it a year ago. You seldom see back-to-back wins in that category. Joe Mazzulla is part of the evil empire. Like, the Celtics won 64 games last year. You're probably not going to win it. So right there, the top 3 choices, I guess I would have a bone to pick with ESPN. I think the 4 candidates that would stand out the most to me, Ime Udoka, especially if Reed Shepherd is what we saw in Summer League and he gives them an impact, and the Rockets are not only a playoff team, but if that team could surprise and somehow be a 6 seed or at the top of the play-in tournament, Ime Udoka is a strong contender. Jamal Mosley, with the growth that we saw from the Magic last year, is another one that makes a lot of sense. Taylor Jenkins, because I think everybody wrote off the Grizzlies.
That's what I was going to say.
They're going to be healthy this year if they're good. I think Taylor Jenkins is the most likely candidate. But the other one that really intrigues me is Kenny Atkinson, because if the Cavs are a 3 seed with basically the same group and they look better, maybe they're even a 2 seed and they win the Central Division. That's another one that makes a lot of sense to me for the Coach of the Year. Most improved player, we said no real involvement there from the Bucks. 6th man of the year, Bobby Portis was 6th for ESPN. He's been a finalist each of the last few years. They picked Malik Monk to win it this upcoming season. Again, I don't know if it's going to be 2 straight years of Malik Monk winning the or was it Malik Monk or Naz Reid last year? Now I can't.
It was Monk last year, wasn't it?
Okay. Regardless, I don't know about that one. To me, I don't think it's going to be Bobby Portis. I think we've kind of seen he gets just enough attention, but he's not seriously considered for the award. So I would say there's no real Buck in consideration for that. Bobby would have the best chance. I don't really have a problem with where ESPN has him at 6th.
If Bobby Portis is one of those guys where, like you mentioned, he's been a finalist the last few years for what he's done. If the Bucks can get out their campaign for 6th man of the year, Bobby, and start providing numbers, if he has another season, let's say he has another season like last year under Doc, where the numbers look good. He is somebody who's coming off the bench more often than not. So assuming health as well, where he continues to be in that bench role for the team, I think it would have to be on play court, but also a bit of the lobbying on the side as well, just to make people aware of what Bobby Portis is doing, because he's not going to like lead bench players with points off the bench. It's going to have to be like that complete effort of what Bobby Portis brings to the team. So I could see him being another finalist again this year if he continues to up his play, continues to be a guy primarily coming off the bench as well. But I do want to ask you this, Justin. I see it in the comments here when we come on the other side of the break. But the comments, Q brought up that he could see Dame actually being a more profitable MVP choice than Giannis if all things go well for the Bucks. So I do want to get your opinion on that and have a conversation about Dame or Giannis. Let's say everything goes right for the team. Which one of those two will most likely have a stronger MVP case this upcoming season?
Yeah, the MVP discussion is going to be an interesting one. We'll get into that coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Well, it's time to talk to you now about our friends over at FanDuel. As you've heard us mention FanDuel quite a bit, they are America's #1 sports book. Well, we have something a little different for you today because now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. And we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NBA podcast. As we know, there's no offseason in the NBA, and Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And just to wrap up on the sixth man, Camille, I don't know what your thoughts are. To me, it seems like Alex Caruso is probably a no-brainer for that award.
Yeah, if he's coming off the bench for the Thunder and this Thunder team performs at the level I think that they can, Caruso feels like a perfect piece for what they're trying to get done over there. So I could definitely see that. And just to clear up what we were talking about, it was Naz Reid who won Sixth Man of the Year this past season. So I know him and Malik Monk were really close there, but it was Naz Reid who pulled that out. But going into this upcoming season, I could definitely see a really strong case for Caruso to win it. Maybe it is Malik Monk this year as well if he stays healthy, because he was a front runner for a lot of this past season. But the injuries kind of happened along the line as well for him. And who knows what the DeRozan pickup in Sacramento as well, and then having Malik come off the bench there, what that dynamic might look like for them. So, I think it's a few different options out there. But to your point, if I had to put money on it today, I would probably go with Caruso, assuming he's not starting for the Thunder.
Yeah, and in terms of Naz Reid too, it's a contract year for Rudy Gobert, so who knows what could happen there. I mean, it could be heavy starter minutes for Naz Reid this upcoming season. Before we do touch on the MVP portion of it, Defensive Player of the Year, Victor Wembanyama was the choice here. Rudy Gobert still coming in at second. Giannis came in 8th. Do you see any scenario where Giannis can finish in the top 3 of Defensive Player of the Year?
I mean, there's a scenario for sure, but I do think that Victor Wembanyama he's an early front runner for sure. I mean, there was votes for him last year when you saw how poor the Spurs were doing, but just his particular skill set and just the way that he is able to affect the game on the defensive end of the floor. Like, it feels like this is an award that's going to be Wemby's for quite some time, or at least he's in that top 2, top 3 discussion for the next few years if he continues playing and elevating his game the way that we all think is possible for someone with the generational talent like he has. But for Giannis, again, it would have to do with the Bucks having a real big bounce back year, I think, with them being a top defensive team again. You would have to see the numbers for Giannis showing up. The blocks have to show up. You have to see him doing things where you're like, he's really affecting the game defensively. And I think that's part of what hurt the Bucks last year. It's just like, you're looking at the actual defensive numbers and like, the Bucks aren't a top 5, top 10 defense. So it's like, it's hard to give somebody a Defensive Player of the Year award when their squad isn't even competing at that level. So for Wemby, though, and the Spurs to get that, again, that defense has to really step up for them, but his skill set is there for sure.
And I lied. One more thing we're going to slip in before the MVP discussion. Speaking of Wemby, he's the choice for most improved player from ESPN as well. And can we stop with the, second year player wins most improved award, especially someone of the talent level of Victor Wembanyama? Like, you don't see that type of generational talent win most improved, because this is what's expected. And all the conversation that we were having about him last year too, in the second half of the season, of, do you foresee him being the best player in the league in the next 2 or 3 years? Those types of guys don't win most improved player. I mean, I think if you look at the last 25 years, Giannis is certainly in there, but Giannis's story was a little bit different. When he was drafted, nobody thought Giannis was going to be a 2-time MVP. So Giannis is clearly the best of the last 25 years to win it. Take him out of the mix, it's been like Paul George and Jimmy Butler. That's the caliber of player that you're seeing win the most improved player award. So look, I get Victor Wembanyama is going to be special and want to give him everything that we can, but I just take great issue with giving out the most improved to a second-year player, because that's your job, is to
improve in your second year. Yeah, and that's fair. And I think this award has kind of changed, it feels like, over the last few years, where it's kind of like which young guy has just kind of like exploded. Like for me last year, I was looking at Kobe White, where I was like, I think that that's a real most improved and player candidate right there, because people were thinking that Kobe White's career was going to be done in Chicago, like a bust. And he came out and showed like, hey, I'm actually a starting caliber player in the NBA. Had a crazy streak there for a little bit with Chicago. But again, the way that the award has gone, once Ja Morant won it in 22
3 years ago,
I believe it was. I was like, okay, I see how this is going. Lauri Markkanen was the year after that, I believe.
Which that was deserved.
Right. And then Tyrese Maxey, who made a jump from just a starter to an all-star, where it's like, that's the kind of award this is now, from that type of jump, rather than just somebody who's been floundering and then has become productive more so than anything else.
Okay, the MVP discussion. So we've had in the comments from a few people questioning, hey, is Dame a better play at MVP, especially from a gambling perspective, than Giannis is? When we did the Locked On Fantasy preview and were asked, what is your hot take for the season? I really thought hard about Damian Lillard is going to outscore Giannis and is more likely to win an MVP award, just because of everything that we have heard from Doc Rivers, even before his arrival, in the importance of getting Dame going, and don't try to fit in. They need to fit in around you. Some of the other things that we've heard throughout the offseason of, here's our plan. You'll bring it up the floor when this happens. Giannis will bring it up the floor when that happens. I think we all saw how Giannis played in the Olympics, and it's easy to say, well, what if you did that for us and played more of a, you don't want him to be a back to the basket guy, but more of a role of a traditional big, where Dame is the ball handler and the guy that's scoring from the outside. Just the overall chemistry between the two of them. Giannis basically stayed himself last year and has been that consistent force the last, 5-6 years. It was Dame's numbers that were impacted. So it is kind of easy to wonder, okay, once this gets optimized and starts working, is it going to be Dame that sees the biggest boost? I still have a very hard time going against Giannis and saying, look, this guy is clearly the best player on the team. That's the struggle. And I think ultimately for Giannis, that's going to be the struggle for MVP overall is, well, if it works, okay, you had Dame. And especially if Dame's numbers are better, well, you had a really good player on your team.
You did. But I think the thing that makes Dame's hypothetical before the season started, we have no numbers in front of us, MVP case a little bit stronger, is MVP case is driven a bit by narrative as well. So if it's a year for Dame where after last year people are wondering, oh, I think Dame might have fallen off a little bit, it's not the same Damian Lillard anymore. If he comes out and he's averaging, 30 points a game, whatever that might be for him, and he's hitting the big shots that people have grown to know Dame for, I think it's easier to point to the narrative piece of that as well and say, like, well, we saw last year, he wasn't playing well. Not only has he improved his play, but the Bucks are, the top 3 seed in the East, whatever that seeding has to be to also strengthen the case. I think the narrative piece for Dame having a good season would be a stronger argument than if Giannis has a good season, because like I mentioned earlier, like Giannis's dominance is really consistent. It's a lot of the same things. And I saw someone in the comments, I think it was Q, yes, who mentioned like a special season is easier to spot for Dame than it is for Giannis. And it's just play style as well. Like the long threes, the deep threes, the off the dribble shots, all of that is going to always get a little bit more attention than finesse around the rim, than dunks around the rim, when that's the same diet of shot selection that you're seeing. So I could definitely see a pathway if the Bucks were a top 2, top 3 seed in the East, and Damian Lillard has a big bounce back season where his MVP case is the one that's talked a little bit more than Giannis's.
To that point, last season was a special season for Giannis. I mean, we recognized it, but didn't seem like anybody else outside of Milwaukee and Bucks fans really recognized it. We both have some more thoughts on the MVP, so we will get into that. And as we mentioned, where Giannis slotted in on the Hoop Collective's draft of players you would want to start your franchise with. We'll touch on that in our final segment coming up next here on Locked On Bucks. This next segment of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by BetterHelp, and we all have self-care non-negotiables. Maybe it's leg day that you never skip when you go to the gym. Well, you should consider the same for therapy day. Our schedule is packed. Maybe it's kids' activities. You got big work projects that you're dealing with. Anything else outside of that, it's easy to let your priorities slip. Even when we know that's what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online. They're designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do to get started is fill out a brief questionnaire. From there, you'll get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can even switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, so the MVP awards here, Camille. I mean, we touched on the big pieces of this. To that point, it's easier to spot a special season from Dame. I think we're both aligned here when we say, I think Giannis, of all these awards, the most likely to see happening is Giannis winning the MVP.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen if the Bucks finish 4th or 5th. It has to be first or second in the Eastern Conference for him to win the MVP award, unless we see what we've seen in the West in recent years, where you have, let's say, 3 teams, the Bucks, the Celtics, maybe it's the Sixers or the Knicks, winning high 50s to 60 games. If that's the case, then maybe. But otherwise, you got to be first or second to win the MVP award. I just don't know what to expect from that duo. Not in a sense of, I don't know if they're going to be good, but I don't know what to expect in terms of the share. Is it going to be like what we saw last year, where maybe Dame is more efficient, Giannis continues to be the 30 points a game guy with efficiency as well, and Dame takes a secondary role? Or do we see Giannis's numbers start to come down and it's more of a like-for-like performance for the two of them?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, last year Dame averaged 26 and Giannis averaged 30. So combined, they averaged like 55, 56 points together. If this season you look at it and it's like maybe they both, as you said, maybe Giannis takes a step back and you see Dame's numbers go up, but a lot of it too could be where Giannis continues to get his 30, and it's just that Dame's a bit more efficient than what he was last year, and you see that points per game go up for Dame. Similar volume, maybe a little bit more for him, but to see the efficiency go up, and that helps his numbers as well. And you might have 2 guys flirting with that 30 points per game, or Dame being at high 20s next year. But I do think when you do have 2 really good players like that on your team, it can hurt the MVP case for both players. And that's the thing where it comes for the Bucks, where it's like, if I had to put money on who was going to win MVP, I would probably stay away from Dame and from Giannis, just because it's like I can't call it between the two, and I'm not sure how other voters are going to look at the duo being together and taking away from their case. And I was trying to think of like who was somebody else who had like a star next to them and still won MVP. And I think of like when Kevin Durant was in OKC and he got that MVP, and you see Russ in the background looking at the trophy a little bit and everything like that. But it's just not as common, I don't think, when you have two all-stars on your team.
Giannis won the award 2 straight years with Chris Middleton. No, it's a good point. And I think you agree, though. I think we touched on that in the last segment, that Giannis is, of all these awards, most likely is Giannis to win the MVP.
Yeah.
I would still, I think 5 is low, because I think it's only natural that you have the awards, and we saw it with Steph Curry, we saw it with Kobe, we've seen it with LeBron. You have those honors, and then it's okay, on to the next. We're bored with this person. But then if you sustain that, or if you have another season where it's the, not blip on the radar, but man, they really upped their numbers from a couple of years ago, then you're back in the conversation. I think we're in line for that type of year from Giannis, where he had the back-to-back awards, didn't win the title, so we're done with him, and we've moved on to the next thing in Nikola Jokic and Joel Embiid. But now the cycle is turned, where I think there's the door being open here for Giannis. Luka Doncic was the pick for ESPN. And again, if you pressed me, that would probably be my choice, because we talked about this last year too, of it's kind of like with the MVP award, it's turns. It was Giannis's turn. It was Jokic's turn. Embiid finally got his turn. Luka Doncic is probably the next in line for that turn. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander's an interesting one. He was 3rd. Anthony Edwards, 4th, an interesting one there as well. Whoever finishes higher in the Western Conference between those two, I think is going to finish higher in the MVP voting. Nikola Jokic is 2nd. Now, before I touch on that, Giannis is the highest of any Eastern Conference player. So the top 4 choices from ESPN are all Western Conference players. And then you have 3 straight Eastern Conference players in this order, with Giannis, Embiid, and Jason Tatum at 7 in the MVP award. So what does that say to you, that while it's still relatively low for what you would expect, although we've seen Giannis in the top 5 for basically all of the last, 6-7 years now, that Giannis is still viewed as the guy with the highest chance in the East?
That there is a lot of respect for his game still. Like we mentioned, the fact that Giannis had a special year last year, but not that many people seem to acknowledge how special of a year that he had. And I mean, of course, it's everything else that was going on with the team at the time, but that there's still a level of respect for what Giannis does. And I think too, even watching him in the Olympics, where you see him and you're just like, okay, like this man, like it's out of this world when you watch him play. The talent is still there. The drive is still there. Just the force that he plays with is still there. And he's going to get his. He led the Olympics in points per game as well during his time there. So it's one of those things where it's like the respect is still there for sure, but there's also an acknowledgement of the next crop of guys coming up and giving them their flowers as well. To your point about Luka, like he's been in the conversation for a while. SGA, even during the Olympics, like I remember some of the calls where I think it was D Wade on the call saying like, that was my MVP pick last year. Like that's the real MVP right there. So like there's going to be some of that. And then we look at the Western Conference landscape. We've talked about just how deep and how many teams there are really in championship contention in the West, and how difficult it's going to be for a team to come out of the West. And I think that competition level over there also adds to the MVP case for some of those Western Conference guys. Luka has been really consistent. You saw him finally get to the final stage last year, and I'm sure he's going to come back with a vengeance. We've seen the ascension of Anthony Edwards, where it's like people are looking at him, they're seeing him take that jump, and a logical jump for him would be MVP consideration as well. SGA, you're going to keep Joker in there still as well. So like it's a stacked field for sure, but I think it says that one, the West is really tough and there's a lot of young talent in the West coming up, but also there's still a lot of respect for what Giannis has done, even if it's not going to be top 3 MVP voting.
Okay, before we touch on the who would you start your franchise with draft, the last thing you said there of you're going to keep Joker in there as well. I am not trying to say he is not one of the all-time great players, and arguably, as much as we love and tout Giannis, arguably the best player in the league. I'm not convinced you're going to keep Jokic in there, because he's already gotten 3 MVP awards. So just as we said with you kind of move on to things. You've gotten 3 in the last 5 years. I think it is 4 years.
3 years.
I think we're going to see a shift of just kind of moving on, especially when you look at the Western Conference as a whole. You mentioned the teams that are expecting to win. I mean, at this moment, I would say there's 2 teams in the West that basically know and expect they will not be playoff teams, in the Jazz and the Trailblazers. Every other team, at the most part, for the most part, thinks they at least have a chance to get into the play-in tournament. The teams that have gotten better, maybe the Pelicans. We've seen a lot of hype around Zion in his offseason. They made the trade for DeJounte Murray. They finished 8th last year. Maybe they think they're a top 6 team. We touched on the Memphis Grizzlies, who were not a playoff team last year. It was the year from hell. They've gotten everybody back. They're healthier. They added Zach Edey. They're going to be a playoff team. The Warriors were 10th. They're probably still a play-in tournament team, but you could make a case they gotten better despite the loss of Klay Thompson with the other moves that they made. The Mavericks, adding Klay Thompson, were a finals team last year. They finished 5th. There's a strong chance the Mavs finish in the top 3 in the Western Conference this season, and I don't see the Timberwolves or the Thunder going away. So Phoenix, by the way, Bud is going to make that team better. So that's another team that could potentially be a top 4 team. The point being, I don't know where the Denver Nuggets are going to finish, especially considering some of the hits they took in the offseason. And you couple that with the fact that Jokic has already won 3 of these. I think we are going to move on. And I hesitate to say I'd be surprised, but I'm going to go right up against that line if Jokic finishes in the top 3 of MVP discussion this year.
He might just end up being someone who's actually just top 5 going forward. I think his name is still going to be in that conversation. You make all really good points about how difficult it's going to be for him to continue that piece, especially with the offseason loss of KCP for the Nuggets this year, and how this team is going to bounce back from that going into this upcoming season. So voter fatigue is real. That's a real thing. And there were already conversations this past year about, like, do we really want to give him a 3rd MVP? That's going to put him into the company of such and such and such and such, where it's like, we're not even looking necessarily at the game itself, but we're looking at, if he wins this award, what does it do for where his place in the history of the league? Like, where does that put him? So I think top 3 for Jokic it could be out the picture for him. I'm not going to put it past him at this point, because every time I seem to be like, nah, it's not going Joker's way. Like, he just does things that he's just, again, a consistent presence, kind of similar to Giannis, where it's like, you know what you're going to get from Jokic night in and night out. But I do think he's still top 5 MVP considerations upcoming season, even if it's not a serious look at number 1. I think his name is still going to be floated around in there.
Yeah, and that's more my point of not that he's out of the conversation altogether. He's still going to be in that range. I just don't think it's going to be, when you get to the midpoint of the season, he's in the top 3 or he's going to be one of these guys. I think there's partially a youth movement, and then again, players like Giannis that have, okay, we're willing to let you back into this conversation, that are going to nudge past him. We went much longer with that discussion than anticipated. So what we teased of who would you start a franchise with, the draft that the Hoop Collective did, we're actually going to save that for next week, because I don't want to just in passing brush off here's where Giannis came. There's a very interesting debate, I think, especially with one of the names we've already mentioned and where Giannis slotted in. So we'll touch on that next week on the show. We're also going to be, I know I mentioned it a couple of times, in the process of conducting our wins draft. So that'll be coming up, we think, at some point next week on the show as well. That will do it for today's show, though. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again next week on Locked On Bucks.